Welcome to Fear and Greed, the week ahead. I'm Sean Aylmer, and as always, I'm joined by economist Stephen Koukoulas. You'll find him at thekouk.com, TheKouk.com, and on Twitter using the handle thekouk. Stephen, good morning.
A very good morning, Sean.
This is like the glory days for economists at the moment, isn't it? Something's going to actually happen.
Big things are happening, and I think as we've been alluding to in recent weeks of our week ahead podcasts, inflation was brewing. We had confirmation last week that the March quarter CPI blew the lid off just about every forecast that I could see. Headline inflation at 5.1%. The trimmed mean, that sort of underlying measure that the Reserve Bank likes to look at to strip out volatile items like petrol and tobacco prices and these things, 3.7%. And remember, that's in the context of the target of 2 to 3%. So, wow, I think was the answer. And you've got every person and their dog now shouting, the 0.1% cash rate is no longer appropriate. The RBA needs to start going and hiking and doing what's happening in the US, in New Zealand, Canada, the UK, South Korea, whatnot, and hike rates.
Okay, so we'll get on to tomorrow's board meeting. But one thing that Josh Frydenberg said last week, and obviously he's in electioneering mode, he kind of gently reminded the Reserve Bank that it was also waiting for wages to get between 2 and 3%. That information we won't know for another 3 weeks or so. Now, Frydenberg also said the Reserve Bank's independent, but it was just like a gentle nudge. Is it the fact that the inflation figures were so strong last week that wages information that the Reserve Bank's waiting on probably has become overwhelmed?
Yeah, look, in an ideal world, and if this inflation report that we saw last week was sort of on expectations, elevated but not through the ceiling, if you like, then maybe, just maybe, the RBA could have presented a case and saying, look, we really do want to see that this low unemployment rate that's in Australia is filtering into this wage acceleration, which everybody wants to see. We've had really weak wages growth for many years now, so we do want to see wages growth picking up. So the Treasurer's right in a way that, you usually don't get sustained increases in inflation unless you've got sustained wages growth at 3% even, or even a touch above, depending on your productivity results. So in theory, he's correct. But this number, that inflation number, and the anecdotes that we're getting, and I know anecdotes are anecdotes. People walk around the shopping centre and say, oh, there's lots of people, so retail sales must be strong. That's really bad. But I think on the labour market, with the job ad series, the vacancy series, the NAB survey, which asks businesses about can you find suitable labour and these sorts of things, everybody's screaming that the skill shortages are there and wage pressures. I think it's just a matter of time before those numbers pick up. So the RBA has no need to wait anymore. Okay,
so tomorrow's a board meeting. What do you think they'll do?
Yeah, look, they're going to hike. There's a little bit of a debate, and they've got to get the trajectory onto quarter percentage point moves. So they either go 15 basis points to 0.25% from the current 0.1%, or they maybe go 40. We've seen the Bank of Canada and the RBNZ hiking 50 basis points in recent weeks. So, and we're starting from a position, as we were just saying, of 0.1%. So it wouldn't be the worst thing for them to go 40 basis points to get us the cash rate at 0.5%, and then, of course, signalling probably more hikes are needed. But really, they've got to acknowledge that, in a way, it's a good news story that that unemployment rate being low is good. Inflation's exceeded their target like a couple of years earlier than they were even thinking. And in a sense, they could sort of craft the language, if you like, to say, look, we're hiking rates because the economy has recovered more aggressively and much, much earlier than we were forecasting when we set the cash rate at 0.1%.
Yeah. I mean, a rising interest rate environment is very different to a falling interest rate environment for homeowners, for investors, across the board, for small businesses. It will be interesting because it's been 10 years since we've had rising home loan rates. And even though they're very, very low at the moment, interest rates are very low, record lows, in fact, it is a very different environment to be operating in.
Yeah, it is. And of course, during that 2010 was the last rate hike that was announced from the RBA. Gosh, that's a long time ago. And of course, we've had household debt and leverage increasing quite dramatically. We shouldn't forget also that businesses carry debt. They've got overdrafts and lending facilities. So they're going to be paying more for their borrowing costs, inevitably, with rates going up. But that's what it's meant to do. Rate hikes are meant to sort of cool the economy down to get inflation back under control. And so when we hear what will be clearly a lot of media coverage of various box pops of people saying, oh, my mortgage is $1 million, I'm paying an extra $500 a month on my repayments. And I do feel for those people. However, prudent borrowers should have known that the 0.1% cash rate wouldn't last forever. Yep. That was clear. The timing was always open to question. And when the bank lent them the money, the bank should have done the stress test and plugged in at a very minimum a 2.5 percentage point increase in mortgage rates. Of course, that was changed to 3% late last year as that buffer on lending. Otherwise, the person shouldn't have got the loan. So, yes, it's going to hurt a lot of people with a lot of debt, but that's sort of what it's meant to do, I'm afraid to say. And that's how the economy cools back down and inflation comes back under control. That's how monetary policy works.
Okay, so it'll all be about inflation and interest rates this week, but there's still actually a bunch of other bits and pieces of information that'll be pretty interesting. The CoreLogic house prices for April.
Oh, yes, and that's going to be absolutely fascinating, and it's going to confirm what we've seen, because we do get their daily data on their webpage. So what we've seen in the last few months is a clear cooling in Sydney and Melbourne. Prices, I'll say going down, but it's only sort of down 0.1 or 0.2%, so it's more a topping out rather than a fall in house prices. So that's probably going to continue to be reflected in the numbers that we see. Also, places like Brisbane and Adelaide are still booming. Yeah, they're having monthly increases of close to 1.5 or 2%, annual increases of 25 to 30% still. So they're not slowing down at all. So I think the CoreLogic series will probably show nationwide house prices cooling off a bit. But, we don't have one housing market in Australia. We've got the 8 capital cities plus the regions, which are still going gangbusters as well. So a really interesting report.
And then the job ads, of course, we're all watching that at the moment in terms of inflation, of course, but wage costs and, whether we can eventually get below 4% unemployment rate.
Yes, and they've been choppy. Look, the ANZ job ads are a bit of a hard thing to forecast, but they have been strong. They are an indicator of hot demand for labour. So, look, we'll see whether there's any material change in the trend there. But for the moment, they have been very strong, and they're signalling a hot demand for labour still.
Well, Stephen, enjoy the week. I'm looking forward to next week already, because then we'll get the wash up from everything that's happening this week, particularly around the Reserve Bank and rates.
Oh, we'll be able to dissect that beautifully. I'm looking forward to it.
That was economist Stephen Koukoulas, better known as The Kouk. You can find him at thekouk.com and follow him on Twitter using the handle The Kouk. I'm Sean Aylmer, and this is Fear and Greed, the week ahead.